On July 4, 1776, the 13 American colonies declared themselves the independent United States of America. With this action, they started a war that would rage for 7 years against the mighty British Empire until finally, in 1783, with the Treaty of Paris, the United States of America won. Not only did they win their independence, but they also doubled the size of their territory. But it was not just the Americans who fought in this war. In fact, most of the major nations of the world were involved either directly or indirectly. So today we are going to find out how each major nation reacted to American independence. France was the first major power to support the American Revolution, and arguably the most important one. The French had been supplying the rebels since the beginning of the conflict, secretly providing them with weapons and ammunition, training their soldiers, and also funding their war effort. But when things started looking bad for the Americans, the French decided to come out of the shadows and form an official alliance with them. This happened after the British captured the city of Quebec in 1775, something that threatened the very existence of the rebellion. To prevent the collapse of the rebellion, the French government sent out an envoy to offer them military and financial aid. And once the Americans accepted, France became the first major power to openly support the American cause. In 1778, France and America signed a Treaty of Alliance, which stated that both nations were now allies and would fight together against the British. The treaty further stipulated that if the alliance held for at least 6 years, then France would help the Americans recover any territories lost during the war. But France was not alone in this alliance. Spain and the Dutch Republic also joined the fray, although they did so more out of self-interest than a desire to help the Americans. Still, their participation was crucial in weakening the British. While the Dutch mainly provided money, Spain went all in by sending troops and navy ships to America. But no other nation contributed more to the American victory than France. They sent over 17,000 troops, hundreds of ships, and tens of thousands of tons of supplies and provisions. This military aid helped the Americans win several major battles, including the Battle of Yorktown, which effectively ended the war. It is because of this that when the Treaty of Paris was signed, France received 3 million livres as war reparations, a sum far less than what they spent on the war. But this amount was never paid due to the French Revolution. However, the American debt did play a role in the French Revolution, because in order to pay back their war debts, the Americans sold huge amounts of bonds to the French public. And this transfer of wealth from France to America encouraged many French citizens who felt that their own country was being neglected. As a result of this dissatisfaction, the French Revolution broke out, and France's role in the American Revolution is often remembered as the first casualty of the French Revolution. If there is one country that deserves second place for its role in the American Revolution, it is Russia. When the war between the Americans and the British began, Empress Catherine the Great of Russia was intrigued by this new conflict halfway across the world. You see, ever since Peter the Great's era, Russia had been modernizing their military and navy in order to challenge the dominance of the Swedish and Danish navies in the Baltic Sea. But those plans were thwarted when the 7 Years' War broke out. And in the middle of this war, the Russians learned that the British were strengthening their naval presence in the Baltic. Fearing that the British could take advantage of the situation and beat them to the punch, the Russians kept a close eye on the war in America. In 1775, Catherine organized a secret conference with the Swedish king to discuss the war in America and its implications for them. And a year later, she traveled to the Baltic coast to inspect the Russian navy and to observe the British naval forces. Catherine realized that the war in America was going badly for the British, so she saw it as an opportunity to check British power. And this explains why she stayed neutral throughout the war. She didn't want to risk entering into a conflict that could end up being a long and costly one. Instead, she took a wait-and-see approach, hoping that the Americans could weaken the British enough for her to strike a decisive blow. In 1778, when France openly aligned itself with the Americans, Catherine was furious, but she still did not join the war. Instead, she watched as the French fleet was decisively beaten by the British at the Battle of the Chesapeake in 1780. Finally, with the war seemingly coming to an end, Catherine decided to enter the scene. That year she organized the First League of Armed Neutrality, which consisted of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Russia. Their goal was to force the British to end the war with the Americans and allow the Russians to recover their captured Baltic holdings. But the British were able to defeat the Russians at sea, shattering the First League of Armed Neutrality. However, this forced the British to negotiate peace with the Americans. So what about the countries that didn't intervene? Well, there were three major European powers that chose to stay out of the conflict: the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, and Great Britain. Let's look at each one. The Holy Roman Empire covered vast swathes of Central Europe and was the largest and most populous entity on the continent. Yet they did not get involved in the American Revolution. The reason for this was that the Habsburg Emperor was preoccupied with securing his dynasty's future. In 1774, when King Louis XV of France died, the Habsburgs saw an opportunity to expand their territory by annexing the French throne, and so they threw their full support behind their candidate, an Austrian duke. On the other hand, the French wanted to keep the French crown within the family, and so they backed the claim of a Bourbon prince. Both sides made a lot of noise, but in the end, the Bourbons won, and the Austrian duke was forced to marry a Bourbon princess and renounce his claim to the French throne. The Habsburgs thought that this was unfair, but they were willing to let it go if the French gave them Belgium and some western territories. But the French refused, something that pushed the Habsburgs towards siding with the British, even though they didn't provide much help. Portugal remained neutral throughout the war because their ruling monarch was insane. He suffered from severe mood swings, paranoia, and even hallucinations, and this instability prevented him from making a decision on the war. Finally, there is Great Britain. They are obviously the aggressors in this story, having fought against the Americans for 7 long years. But that doesn't mean that they didn't try to get other nations to support their war effort. Before the war even began, the British tried to recruit German mercenaries to fight for them, and they even offered the Russian Empress the chance to put 20,000 of her soldiers on the American payroll. But Catherine saw through this offer and declined. The British had hoped that the Russians would remain neutral throughout the war, as was the case, and so they didn't consider the American Revolution as a total loss. After all, if the Americans did win, then they would have another powerful ally against France, an ally that might even convert to Christianity. So in the end, they weren't so upset about losing the Americans. But what about the rest of Europe? How did they feel about the Americans winning their independence? Well, the truth is that they didn't care that much. The American Revolution wasn't really on their minds, and there are 2 reasons for this. First, this conflict was happening on the other side of the world, far away from Europe. And secondly, most Europeans were peasants who lived isolated lives. They didn't know about the revolution, let alone care about it. Even if they did know about the war, they wouldn't care because they were busy trying to survive in one of the deadliest periods in human history. The gap between 1700 and 1800 saw around 50 million people die in Europe due to wars, famines, and plagues. And this makes the American Revolution seem rather insignificant. All in all, there is no denying that the American Revolution was a global event. It saw the participation of most major powers, and it had consequences that extended far beyond the shores of North America. Nevertheless, it is important to remember that this conflict did not have the same impact on every nation. For example, while France and Russia saw the war as an opportunity to check British power, the Holy Roman Empire saw it as a chance to expand their territory. In the end, each nation reacted according to its own interests and priorities,